Thank you very much for the opportunity to come here and present the research project on war and post-war ritual, which we have been conducting now for a number of years, and which takes us back to Northern Europe and back to the pre-Roman and Roman Iron Age, where, as we heard from our Ministry of Culture, there is a tradition of depositing large amounts of military equipment in a number of wetlands, in lakes, which is a tradition which developed here in Scandinavia and culminated during the 2nd to the 5th centuries AD with very comprehensive deposits of weapons and personal equipment, presumably from entire defeated armies. The finds show signs also of deliberate destruction, after which the items were thrown into or dumped from boats into lakes. The most, probably the most comprehensively investigated site is the site of Illerup, which has been excavated in the 1950s, and again in a period from 1975 to 85, and where almost or more than 15,000 items have been recovered, originating from 4 different major events, the first of which is dated to the beginning of the 3rd century, and which is also by far the most comprehensive, with equipment from an estimated 300 to 400 individuals, including both their weapons and the personal equipment. About 20 sites are known from the Scandinavian area of this type, and at least in sort of the core area in Jutland on Funen, it looks like a fairly sort of standardized tradition with relatively uniform practices. Towards the periphery, there's somewhat more variation in the tradition, and that also applies to the later part of this period from the 2nd to the 5th century AD, where we see some other practices also in these finds. They're generally considered to be one of the main sources on the military and political organization in this rather formative period in the European history, with the interaction between the Germanic and the Roman world, and has played a significant role also in drawing up sort of the overall picture of the development of the period. There are, however, also finds which predate this interplay. The Jorspring find is one of the most famous and also one of the earliest, dating back to the mid-4th century BC. But in its composition, it resembles very much what we see in the later weapon depositions, with its focus on the weapons with the destruction aspect, and in this case also with a boat included in the find. There are other finds from this period which show somewhat more variation and other practices, including ceramic depositions or also animal sacrifices. Some of them also seem to be the traces of a number of small-scale events which have accumulated over time, and some of them also include human remains. It is in this group of varied finds we also find the Alken site, which is exactly characterized by a very comprehensive amount of human remains uncovered at what was originally a lake, and dating to the very beginning of the 1st century AD. It is situated in the same valley as the Illerup find, but as I said from the date, it's predating the Illerup by 2 centuries. And the Illerup valley is also known from a number of other depositions, including the Forlev, as you can see on the map, which is a different kind of ritual place with wooden idols, ceramic depositions, animal sacrifices also. It seems to be a more fertility-related find, and dating to the pre-Roman Iron Age. The Alken site is located, as you see, at the end of the valley where it meets the Mossø Lake. From this lake, or from this wetland area, A number of finds have been uncovered in connection with peat digging and drainage work since the mid of the 19th century. And it's something extraordinary that quite a lot of these finds contain human remains, all the red dots on this map here. And which obviously also means that there's been some archaeological interest in the site. So the first archaeological excavations were conducted there from 1957 to 62. And since 2009, we have then been involved in a new project trying to address this site and its find material. In comparison with the previous research on the conflict-related wetland depositions, the project tries to address a number of new questions. Obviously, the archaeological excavation is a main target of the project, but otherwise, it also tries to take up themes which have played a relatively minor role in the previous research on the weapon depositions. It does this in part because the find material is different, that we have the actual human remains which are lacking from the other weapon deposition sites, and which in this way allow a different suite of analysis to be conducted on the material. We can get a much more direct approach to the actual participants in the conflict, and it allows us also to introduce a number of analysis from the health and the natural sciences to characterize these individuals. In part, we are also taking up some themes which haven't had a significant role in the previous research projects, such as the landscape setting of the finds, the social and settlement context, and also looking at the ritual practices and if we can see whether they belong to particular ritual traditions on a broader geographical scale. The map here shows our excavations marked with red. I hope you can see them. And as you can see, there's still some work left to be done in the area. We have tried to address specific questions with the individual excavations, and our main area of interest has been down here near the Mossøy Lake, where we seem to have a concentration of the human remains, and where most of our excavation efforts have been focused. We excavate by making a pumping perimeter around an area and there lowering the water table so that it will allow us on relatively dry conditions to go down through the different lake deposits, and then the finds are documented photogrammetrically, and that then allows us to make various plans and analysis of the finds. And here you see a part of the excavation from 2013 with the human remains, and as you can see, there's a quite close concentration of finds, and it's also characteristic that far the majority of the bones are found disarticulated. In terms of dating, we have to rely on the radiocarbon dates, but fortunately they also show a relatively consistent picture, a picture which places the find in the first half of the 1st century AD, and the typology of the artifacts further indicates that we are probably in the first part of this interval. The dates are also consistent with all the finds from the entire wetland area, 40 hectares, belonging to just one single event, potentially. The geological analysis shows that the area was originally part of Lake Mossøy, but in the centuries up to the depositions, a number of land spits develop and closes off the lake basin, only having or leaving a small gap between the two basins, and it's exactly at this gap that our finds are and our excavations are concentrated. Here's a close-up, perhaps a bit difficult to see, but there's a gray shading which indicates the course of the sand spits, and you can see that the black parts are the bones, and you can see they're concentrated in the channel between the two lake basins. But there are also a few finds. I'll just point over here if I can make it work. Doesn't really seem to go through the white there. But in the test pits on the right, we also have a few finds which shows that originally the finds appear to have gone up on the dry land and extended over there, that area, but they are no longer preserved in that area. But these different concentrations we see in the different parts of the excavation and the calculation of the minimum number of individuals also allows us to assess the total number of represented individuals within the area where we have been excavating or had the main excavation. And based on these calculations, we end up with that just within this small area here, we should expect to have about 300 to 400 individuals. At a later time, in the 5th century AD, a bridge was constructed across this gap or this channel, and which shows that at that time it was apparently a relatively important communicative setting to call for a bridge to be constructed there. And we actually have wagon parts back into the 2nd century AD, which might indicate that this communicative setting is something which we can push back in time and which may also be of relevance to our interpretation of why the finds are situated here. If we look upon the anthropological analysis of the material, we can see that we are dealing with an exclusive or almost exclusive male population. There are 5% female traits in the material. That's sort of the uncertainty of the determinations. And they are young individuals, and they are characterized by numerous traces of sharp-edged weapon trauma. Some of them, as you can see on the skull and the femur, are quite spectacular with sword and axe marks. Others are much more subtle with indications of spears and lances. The damage is distributed all over the bodies. Those are the red marks on the skeleton. But with a relatively underrepresentation on the upper left torso, which would have been protected by the shield. And in this way, we think the damage pattern is representative of the damage you would get in a relatively structured fighting situation. The damage to the back is probably representing a less structured part of the fighting. And there are also a number of indications, not on this one, but of cut marks in the area of the tension of the knee, which could be attempts to immobilize defeated or sort of captured warriors. The finds, also the few finds which we have, also underline the martial character of the find with the spearheads, some knives which are potential fighting knives, the tip of a sword, an axe, different pieces of shields, and also some wooden clubs. The bones beyond the trauma also reveal further elements of the history of the individuals with traces of animal gnawing, which shows that they were subject to exposure for a period of time before they ended up in the lake. The large breakage of the bone is probably done by wolves. Another traces on the bone shows that there was also a human handling of the bones with different cut and scraping marks concentrated around the ligaments, which probably should be seen as some part of defleshing. And the bones are also collected in bundles, so the central part where you see all the bones of a leg, together with some stones which are not naturally occurring, is probably a sort of weight down situation with the bones. And you can also see the proximal ends of both the lower leg and the femur are together, so they are sort of inverted in relation to the anthropological situation. So they must have been skeletized. And the most compelling evidence of this handling is probably this example of 4 pelvis bones threaded onto a stick from 4 different individuals, male individuals, situated right side, left side, right side, left side, together there. And that obviously must have happened after the bones were skeletized. There are also a number of ceramic depositions that are animal parts found together with the humans, which indicate a ritual aspect accompanying the activities or following shortly after. And altogether, we can, based on these traces, create a relatively detailed reconstruction of the sequence of events that unfolded in connection with this site, starting with the battle and presumably also involving some form of immobilization of the captured individuals in form of these cut marks. With a face, we expect there has been some plundering, as we don't find any of the personal items of the individual. We have the indications of an exposure to the animal activities, which, based on the type of animal gnawing, is estimated to have lasted between a half and a full year. After which the bones were then collected, apparently in parts systematically, and depending on whether the battle site was near or far, there might have been some transport to the place of deposition into the lake, where a number of activities seems to occur, with both breakage of the bones, cremation, accompanying depositions, other modifications of the bones, and then the final depositions into the lake. Sorry. So it seems to reflect, if we sum up, sort of a large-scale conflict. And we're discussing the interpretations of the site, but one of the things we are sort of leaning towards at the moment is that it potentially could be a form of sanctified battlefield on a communicatively central place in the landscape, where different activities took place in the aftermath of the battle after approximately a year, half to a full year. And it is the first of these large-scale depositions in the Illerup Valley, which then continues with quite long intermissions for almost 4.5 centuries after this. The number of individuals which seems to be represented at Alken obviously indicates that we are dealing with a relatively large-scale conflict, also a conflict which may extend significantly beyond the local area. And it's of course significant that in terms of the date we are at a period where there's a considerable upheaval in the northern part of Europe in connection with the Roman expansion or attempt of expansion into the Germanic area. And the provenance of the individuals is obviously a central question in the research projects. But when we look at the provenance, there are actually limited indications that we're dealing with outsiders. There are some individuals in the isotope analysis which may come from outside, but otherwise, both in method analysis, in the isotope analysis, the main indicators are local. So it seems to be the local population we are dealing with. That's at least what we think at the moment. And another local aspect, which are quite new results also coming in here, can be recognized in the environmental evidence, where we have pollen analysis from the nearby lakes, both one very close by and one further away, and where we see a very significant development with a very open landscape in the centuries up to the event, with only about 20% forest cover. And then we have the event after which we see a very significant increase in the forest, up to 80 to 90%, and that stays basically a closed landscape until the Viking Age or even later. So we think that this may reflect some of the impact of this event. When it comes to the ritual aspects, the find is, however, not particularly local. In fact, it stands out from what we see in the remaining archaeological record, almost as something foreign. And some of the nearest parallels are actually found quite far away, and also significantly earlier in the French area and the southern German area, in Switzerland, with, for instance, famous Latin site as a potential parallel where both human remains, weapons, and also other agricultural implements were found when they drained the lake in the 19th century. It might indicate that there are, after all, some quite long-distance connections associated with this, and one of the things we're discussing is whether we're actually dealing with a situation where it's a local site which has been defeated, and we have an incoming site introducing also new elements into the ritual tradition. If I just try to sum up with a few words on what we see also as the wider significance of Alken, and its contribution in relation to existing research. I think one of the main aspects that Alken actually will provide in the long-term perspective is an entirely new source material, in that we get the actual warriors of one of these armies, and this population may serve as a basis for further research, and not only archaeological, but there's also a considerable interest in the fact that we have here a very large and contemporaneously dead population, also from the medical science and from the genetics, that makes the population highly interesting. The project relies on, and can be seen as a continuation of this very strong research tradition which we have had on the weapon depositions, but it has different emphasis also in terms of the methodology, with an extensive use of natural science analysis of the material, and in this way also exemplifies this shift in the archaeological methodology, which Flemming Besenbacher mentioned in the introduction, with a shift towards the more interdisciplinary approaches to the study of this, of the past. In terms of the historical narrative, it is the largest known direct evidence of a conflict in Scandinavia from this period, and it probably in a large part of Europe also. And it seems evident that the events represented at Alken were both dramatic and also had a very considerable impact. And this way, the investigation identifies a historical event in a period which generally has appeared as ahistorical in Northern Europe, and which actually allows us also to pursue a different form of historical explanations of the changes we see in this period, such as operating with disruptions and also discontinuities in our understanding of the cultural development, which has otherwise very much been seen as a continuous development in the discussions of state formation, etc. And finally, there are the cultural links, the indications of long-distance relatedness in the ritual traditions, which may hold significance also for our interpretation of the development of the more formalized religious practices of the later periods. And here, I think Alken joins both in this aspect and in the aspect of the military organization. It joins a group of rather heterogeneous finds, which may be seen as key sites to understand this tumultuous upheaval in the northern and central Europe in the centuries around the turn of our era, and which include both some of these sites of the identified battle sites of the period, and some of the very significant post-conflict ritual sites associated with various cultures in Europe, and with a little understood connection between the different traditions, even though it's evident that there are some inspirations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Mads, for this report on the fascinating situation at Alken Enge. I'm sure that we all in our minds can picture what was going on. But if not, you should go to the Moesgaard Museum to see how it was. Are there any questions for Mads? Yes.
Yes, Bjarne Grønnav. Mads, do you have any idea of where the equipment of this army might be deposited?
No, basically we don't. We have tried to make some geophysics to see if it should be located somewhere else in the wetlands. And it's a bit like looking for a needle in a haystack. We haven't been able to identify that it has been deposited there. So it's possible that it's another tradition where it's not the weapons that are the focus of the ritual activities, but rather the dead individuals. And in a way, it's a bit of an intermediate thing between ritual and cleaning up the battlefield as we see it at the moment. There's a ritual aspect to the practices here, but there's clearly also a sort of clearing of the ground involved in it.
Christina?
Christina Winter Jacobsen. Yes, it is an immensely fascinating find and beautifully exhibited at Moesgaard Museum. I was wondering, when you showed the map of the geographical situation, the location of the finds in this very narrow strip of water, isn't it more likely that they were deposited upstream, and because it was so narrow that they actually ended up sort of caught in that location?
We have been discussing the extent of redeposition, but both based on the sediments there, we think that there's not so much redeposition. Okay, we can see that there is some redeposition from the sides, sort of the relatively steep sides of the channel, where the bones fall down into the to place there. But also the fact that we find, for instance, the pelvises on the bones indicate that they can't have moved so much, and there's very little wear on the bones, indicating redeposition of the material also. And furthermore, we also now here, the last year of the excavation, we start to find all the small bones, which indicate that we are relatively close to the place of skeletization. So we think that we have relatively strong arguments that there's not that much redeposition occurring, that we're close to the original place of deposition.
Helene Blinkenberg-Hastrup. I'd like to ask, why do you think that we have so many remains of battles in this particular area? Do you have any guess as to what went on there?
Personally, I think that this is actually just a question of us having at this time a particular practice where the traces of the battles are becoming visible in the archaeological record. So I think that the number of conflict we see may be extended to a much larger area and period. And I think that's partly also what makes these finds so interesting, that they give us one of those few insights into the scale and the volume of conflict and frequency of conflict also.